Hello learners, this particular session is devoted to unit number 16 of the course NGPE 014 and it pertains to case studies in sustainable development which are very much a part and parcel of the way in which Gandhian alternatives or Gandhian principles have been applied on the ground. In this particular session, we will first try and understand the importance of traditional knowledge systems, discuss the importance of community-based management of resources using traditional methods to conserve our natural capital. And as mentioned, we shall discuss two very important case studies which have been widely cited all over the world. These are case studies from Rajasthan and Maharashtra, which will substantiate these points and also make it very clear what Gandhi meant by the village being really the center and the heart of all developmental activities. So let's begin by first discussing the importance of conservation of natural resources. We all know that this is a great need, particularly in the contemporary times. In the context of rapid increase of population, development strategies which have extracted rather than conserved natural resources in a rather unthinking manner, and of course the environmental crisis that confronts the world. We have discussed these matters in great detail in the previous lectures also. However, we find that local communities have always been repositories of traditional knowledge systems, and these were geared towards their local conditions, resources, and needs. Unfortunately, much of this local knowledge and much of this local wisdom in the entire race for development has somewhere been sidelined, has somewhere been relegated to the margins, so that the needs and the wisdom of local communities themselves, who are the biggest stakeholders in the entire exercise of development, has somehow been left behind. Rather than imposing top-down development, therefore, there is a need to engage with these traditions and knowledge systems even in today's technological era. We find particularly that with liberalization that became a part of the Indian economic agenda in the 1990s, India's economy opened up and has become the home to many business houses and multinational companies. And we see that natural resources are being rather injudiciously extracted and used. Unfortunately, this kind of path of development is mostly serving the interests only of the narrow and the affluent sections of society. We find that the creation of special economic zones, fertile land acquisition, which has become a norm, and as a result, the population in rural areas in many places are protesting against big companies exploiting their resources in an unsustainable manner. And we have seen this in many movements. We've seen these in many rural and environmental movements across the country. Let's talk now about community-based management of resources. And here it is very appropriate to quote the noted environmentalist Madhav Gadgil. Gadgil says, "A prudent management of our natural resources would be the re-establishment of community management systems for common property resources." Such systems functioned well in pre-British India, but were largely destroyed when the British abolished all community control, converting rights into mere privileges. This served to transform waters and lands previously well managed by communities into no man's lands and waters, subject to abuse by all. The key lies in a re-establishment of the relationship between the control over and the use of resources, unquote. This quotation by Madhav Gadgil is extremely important because it really helps us to contextualize what has happened in the colonial period and how this colonial legacy, in a sense, is carried forward even to this day. Gadgil also suggests that we need to set up a network of conservation areas all over the country in order to effectively combine resource management with eco-development. And of course, the key here is participation of the local people. It is very important to realize that local communities are the major stakeholders in all developmental projects and activities. And we've mentioned before that there has been a history of activism right from the Chipko Andolan to the Silent Valley protests, protests against the Coca-Cola factories in Plachimada, mining protests in Odisha and so on, which is basically local populations trying to assert their rights over local resources and protesting against what they see are alien interests taking over their natural resources. We find that the involvement of local leadership, the civil society, academics and policymakers can help to reshape developmental projects in a direction that is beneficial to all. To quote Professor Gadgil once again, good decisions on the environment can only emerge at the appropriate local scale through a bottom-up process of informed decision making, unquote. So the top-down approach towards development, the approach in which decisions are in a sense imposed upon people, this is really not a sustainable model in the long run. Let's now talk about these two case studies that we have mentioned earlier. The first that we'll be talking about is a very, very well-known one of how arid Rajasthan was in a sense transformed due to water harvesting. Now, as you know, wetlands, ponds, lake and tanks are the traditional forms of water management in India. These store water following the rains and they're therefore the most viable forms of water storage. And these are seen in many parts of India, including the states of Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Bihar and Rajasthan. And they serve the needs of the local consumption of the population. Sharma in his 1997 study says that these tanks are economically profitable and also ecologically resourceful for drainage, storage, charging wells and reducing the havoc that is caused by floods. However, with the disappearance of the wells, we find that tube wells have come up in a big way and the tank lands have been encroached upon by local authorities and in some cases even by governmental authorities. In Rajasthan in 1985, in the arid regions, especially in the Alwar district, the excessive drawing of groundwater for crop production resulted in its shallow water table aquifers dwindling to very low levels, as low as 100 to 120 meters. And the forest cover, including the Sariska Tiger Reserve, also witnessed shrinkage. Naturally, when these kinds of environmental disasters take place, we find that there is a massive migration of local population. So the villagers migrated to other places as villages no longer provided them with employment. Farmers could neither grow much food nor fodder or pasture, and even the fuel wood for their basic needs was unavailable, and therefore life had become very, very difficult indeed for the local people. Since the region is mainly comprised of desert and with no water available, the climate too became unbearable. The rains, which had an average of 16 to 50 centimeters per year, came in 3 to 4 high-intensity events in 7 to 10 days rainy season, leaving behind many lands thirsting for water. There was no vegetation or crop cultivation for want of water, naturally. And it is out of this desperation that the traditional methods of the johars were revived. What is a johar? Johar is a traditional system of water storage, especially to meet the water needs in the non-rainy season. They are vital sources of water conservation, simple mud and rubble barriers built across the contour of a slope to arrest rainwater. These structures have high embankments on 3 sides, while the 4th side is left for the entry of rainwater. The shape of johar is concave and resembles a crescent. The water collected in the johar during monsoons is directly used both for irrigation as well as for domestic uses like drinking water and so on. Not just are these johars sources of water conservation, but they also have a very important role to play in the social and cultural life of the community. Most of the ceremonies take place around these structures. The johar is worshipped at the birth of a child in the family. The house is cleaned with water from the johar. After the wedding ceremony, the newly married couple takes a walk around the johar. The bride's family contributes a small amount to the maintenance of the johar. And the last rites of a person also take place near johars. So we find that right from birth to death, community rituals are associated with these structures. So they don't just play an instrumental or a utilitarian function, they also have a very important social and cultural function. Small temples adorn the johar premises, as it not only offers a sacred atmosphere, but also enables people to take a look at the johar and assess if it needs repair or maintenance. Now, how did these johars really become the focus of water harvesting and, in a sense, converting arid Rajasthan once again into a place where people would find life livable and, in fact, sustainable? The Tarun Bharat Sangh, under the leadership of Rajendra Singh, who was popularly known as the Waterman of India, has rendered a yeoman service in reviving the johars all over the arid region. We find that the construction of these johars involved advice and supervision from the village elders and the communities who had traditional knowledge. So the important point that we made earlier, that taking the advice or taking into confidence the local people, having a participatory approach towards development is very, very important. Right from designing the structure, identification of the site, contribution of the cost, maintenance work, all these involve the local community. And all structures were built as need-based and easy to maintain. So remember, technology basically has to be amenable, has to be people-friendly, has to be something that is of use to people and does not require constant monitoring by external experts. And in this sense, the johar is an excellent way of revitalizing tradition to deal with contemporary problems and issues. As a result, we see that water became available, the conditions of the soil improved, there was better vegetation and crops, forestation levels improved and helped in supplying water to the wildlife areas also. Naturally, agriculture became more productive and remunerative. Because of the availability of water, cattle rearing also became important. Dairy farming and milk production were taken up, and overall prosperity at the village level saw a marked increase. Improved irrigation also led to reduced costs on pump sets, diesel, etc., which helped to save a good deal of money. And at the social and the community levels also, the village communities experienced an increase in social cohesion and revival of emotional bonds. Jal Yatras and Jal Chetna Yatras to link people to their traditional water resources and highlight conservation were also some of the important activities of the Tarun Bharat Sangh. Let's now talk about another very important and interesting experiment, if you like, in rural regeneration and in rural transformation using Gandhian principles. And this is the famous example of Ralegan Siddhi, a village located in the drought-prone and rain-shadow zone of Parner Tehsil of Ahmednagar, Maharashtra. The rainwater that was collected in Ralegan was sufficient to cultivate only one crop on 300 to 350 acres of land out of a total of 2,200 acres of land available in the village. So this will give you an idea of just how rain deficient this area was and how difficult farming was in the area. And as a result, extreme poverty haunted this place, and the majority of families, it was said, had to survive only on 1 square meal in a day. With meager or no employment opportunities, and in the absence of sufficient food production, the villagers turned to brewing liquor, and thus the number of breweries in this small place rose to almost 35, even though it was such a small place with such a scarce population. And once alcohol enters the social arena, we find that this leads to a great many social evils. The helplessness and desperation arising from poverty, severe debts and unemployment forced the villagers to follow this path. And like we've mentioned, a major social evil was alcoholism. How did Raleigh Siddhi start transforming? It is said that very often it is the efforts of one committed individual that can really fire up or can really motivate a community to adopt social change. And here it was Anna Hazare, a name that is familiar to all of you. He was one of the inhabitants of the village, and after a brief stint with the army, he returned to his village and was absolutely horrified by the pathetic conditions prevalent. He decided to dedicate his life for the social cause, and from 1975, his work really started. And he, in a sense, started this redevelopment work or started this regeneration work right from his own household itself. And one of the very, very important steps, or one of the very, very important paths that he adopted, was adoption of watershed development programs. Now, these programs, just like in the previous case study that we have spoken about, were not top-down approaches. The villagers were convinced to participate in these programs, leading to a change in their socio-economic conditions. The change was so great that we find that villagers started to harvest 2 crops in 1,500 acres of land, in contrast to the earlier levels of 300 to 350 acres of land for 1 crop. The agricultural production improved, migration to cities came to the halt as the village itself now provided employment opportunities to its inhabitants and also to those in other villages who came there to work as daily laborers on the watershed development projects. And as this process progressed, we find that liquor brewing also came to a halt. The sale of tobacco products like cigarettes was also subsequently given up, and also milk production increased greatly. The cooperatives in the area actually procured this milk, and this led to an increasing of incomes in the villages. We find that the village now has facilities like schools, hostels, sports and gymkhanas. Culturally too, we find that there's a transformation as mass marriages are conducted to avoid unnecessary expenditure, and efforts are on towards bridging the gap of the caste divide and improving social cohesion. This model was also replicated in other villages and yielded encouraging results. Raleigh Siddhi has a Gram Panchayat, a cooperative consumer society, cooperative credit society, cooperative dairy society, an educational society, women's organization, youth organization. In other words, all those organizations which really work towards the social and cultural development of the village as a whole. It is seen as a model village and a case study for scholars, planners, developmental workers, and administrators. And it proves the point that people's participation in conservation of resources is crucial towards all developmental efforts. To conclude, we can say that these 2 case studies that we've discussed stress the importance of traditional knowledge systems and practices that could be effectively put to use in the current phase of development. Unfortunately, we have moved from the precious store of wisdom and knowledge that characterized the life of our ancestors. Many of the traditional practices, many of the ways in which nature was conserved, the way in which nature was venerated, the way in which human beings and natural resources were not seen as contradictory or in conflict, but rather as a process of mutuality and mutual protection and mutual understanding. All these, in a sense, seem to have been overridden by the mad race for development and advanced technology. We also see that every individual can contribute to the good of the society if there is a willingness to do so. Gandhi had proven this with his own life and example, and indeed in the case studies that we've mentioned, it has been committed individuals who have sensitized and awoken their respective communities. Their efforts in reviving traditional systems of knowledge and practice are replicable and should be pursued vigorously if we are to make progress in the real sense of the term. We need to realize that villages are centers of development, as Gandhi had said, and we cannot allow them to perish. Perhaps the Gandhian notion of the village republic, the Gram Swaraj, all these may, in the contemporary times, need to be revisited, may need to be thought through carefully. But there is no denying that the things that he had said about environmental conservation, about being in tune with nature, so that the nation as a whole could prosper, these are things that have a very, very strong message to convey, particularly in times of environmental degradation. These steps alone will ensure the real progress of the nation in a way that the poorest of the poor and the most marginalized person in society can also progress, and there is justice, there is equity, and there is harmony with nature. Thank you.